Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. The sun was setting on the horizon, dyeing the sky blood red over the imposing walls of Troy. 10 years had passed since the first Greek ships touched the city's shores, bringing with them an army thirsty for revenge and glory. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae, looked down on the fortified city from the top of a nearby hill, his face marked by scars and the weight of a decade of fruitless war. Next to him, Odysseus, known for his cunning and unique intelligence, gazed at the walls with a peculiar gleam in his eyes. His fingers drummed unconsciously on the hilt of his sword while his keen mind worked on yet another of his ingenious plans. The sea wind stirred his dark robes, bringing with it the smell of salt and the distant echo of the waves breaking on the beach. 10 years, my dear Odysseus, murmured Agamemnon, his voice laden with bitterness. 10 years of our lives wasted before these walls that seemed to laugh at our impotence. His eyes scanned the Greek camp spread across the plain below, where thousands of tents stretched as far as the eye could see. Troop morale was at its lowest, and whispers of giving up were beginning to spread like a plague among the soldiers. It was at this point that Odysseus, with an enigmatic smile, shared his idea. What if we could get the Trojans themselves to invite us in? His seemingly absurd proposal soon began to take shape in calculated words and precise gestures. The plan of the wooden horse was born there, under the bloody sky of Troy. Within the city walls, life was taking its tense but routine course. Priam, the venerable king of Troy, walked through the palace gardens accompanied by his daughter Cassandra, whose eyes always seemed to see beyond the present. The young prophetess carried with her the weight of a curse, the gift of predicting the future, but never being believed. "Father," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon, "I see shadows approaching our walls. They are not shadows of open warfare, but of deceit and betrayal." Priam, as always, only smiled indulgently, attributing his daughter's words to his fertile imagination. After all, the Greeks seemed as worn out as themselves after a decade of unresolved conflict. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and Priam's eldest son, supervised the training of the troops in the main courtyard. His younger brother, Paris, whose abduction of Helen had triggered the whole war, watched from a distance, carrying the weight of the guilt he never openly admitted. Helen, for her part, remained in her quarters, her legendary beauty still able to dim the sun's glare. But her eyes bore the melancholy of someone who knew she was the cause of so much suffering. In the Greek camp, the construction of the horse began under the utmost secrecy. Epius, the most skilled carpenter among the Greeks, led a select team of craftsmen. The sound of hammers and saws echoed day and night, camouflaged by other camp noises so as not to arouse suspicion. The horse gradually took shape, a majestic structure as tall as 3 men, with enough space inside to house dozens of chosen warriors. Meanwhile, Odysseus personally selected the men who would take part in the riskiest mission of their lives. Each chosen warrior knew that the chances of success were as uncertain as the chances of survival. Among them were Diomedes, known for his boundless bravery, and Neoptolemus, son of the late Achilles, who was eager to prove his worth. As the plan developed, the tension in the Greek camp grew proportionally. Some veterans questioned the wisdom of the strategy, considering it a last act of desperation. Others, however, saw it as the only real hope of victory after years of failure. Laocoon, a Trojan priest devoted to Poseidon, began to have disturbing dreams. In his night visions, he saw Troy consumed by flames while a giant horse watched the destruction with empty eyes. His attempts to warn the city council were often met with skepticism, as were Cassandra's prophecies. The air was full of foreboding. Birds flew in strange formations over the city, and the sea seemed rougher than usual. The gods, high up on Mount Olympus, watched with renewed interest as events unfolded, some cheering for the Greeks, others for the Trojans, but all eager to see how that decade of conflict would come to an end. The construction of the horse progressed, and with it grew the expectation among the Greeks. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the exact moment to present the offering to the words that would be spoken to convince the Trojans of its authenticity. The structure was adorned with religious symbols and inscriptions dedicated to the goddess Athena, a calculated attempt to appeal to the Trojans' piety and religiosity. In the city, routine continued, but there was a growing unease in the air. Warriors on the walls reported strange movements in the Greek camp, although nothing that could be clearly identified as a threat. The population, exhausted from a war that seemed to have no end, longed for any sign that the conflict might be coming to an end. The horse was taking shape not only as a physical structure, but as a symbol of hope for the Greeks and, unknowingly, as a harbinger of destruction for the Trojans. Its shadow was already casting itself over the fate of both peoples, even before its conclusion, marking the beginning of a new phase in the decade-long war. As the sun rose over the Greek camp, the last details of the huge wooden horse were being finalized under the close supervision of Epius. The craftsman circled the structure with critical eyes, checking every joint, every fitting, ensuring that his creation was not only convincing in appearance, but also safe for the warriors who would soon hide inside. Odysseus gathered the warriors selected for the mission in his tent. The atmosphere was charged with tension as he explained the final details of the plan. Each man had to memorize his specific position on the horse and the exact moment of his action. A mistake, no matter how small, could cost not only their lives, but the entire operation. "Remember," said Odysseus, his voice low but firm, "when we are inside the walls of Troy, silence will be our greatest weapon. A whisper, a cough, any sound can give us away." His eyes traveled over the faces of the chosen men, finding in each of them the determination needed for the mission. Among the warriors, Diomedes organized small combat groups, assigning specific responsibilities for when the time came for action. Some would be responsible for eliminating the guards, others for opening the main gates, and a special group would head straight for the royal palace. In the camp, preparations began for the staging of the departure. Tents were dismantled for two purposes. Some would actually be taken to the ships, others would be hidden in the nearby hills, where the army would wait for the signal to return. The movement had to look genuine in the eyes of the Trojan lookouts. Inside Troy, Cassandra walked restlessly through the corridors of the palace. Her visions were becoming more intense and disturbing. In her dreams, she saw wooden horses crying tears of blood and heard the screams of her burning city. He tried to warn everyone he met, but as always, his words were met with polite smiles and looks of pity. Laocoon, sharing the same concerns, sought an audience with King Priam. The priest argued that the gods had sent him signs of imminent danger. "My king," he pleaded, "Poseidon stirs the waters with unusual fury. The sacrifices show dark omens. We must redouble our vigilance." Priam, although he respected the priest's devotion, was tired of living under the constant cloak of fear. "For 10 years we have kept our walls impregnable," he replied gently. "If the Greeks leave, it will be a blessing from the gods, not a curse." In the Greek camp, Agamemnon coordinated the logistics of the false retreat. Ships were prepared ostentatiously, loaded with supplies and equipment in full view of the Trojans. The smoke from the campfires gradually diminished, creating the illusion of an army in the process of abandoning the siege. Neoptolemus, eager to prove his worth, trained tirelessly with other chosen warriors, practicing silent movements and combat techniques in confined spaces. The young warrior carried not only the weight of his own ambition, but also the legacy of his father, Achilles. As the day progressed, an atmosphere of expectation hung over both sides of the conflict. The Greeks, knowing his plan, could hardly contain their anxiety. The Trojans, watching their enemies' movements from the walls, began to speculate on the meaning of his apparent retreat. Helena, from the top of her tower, watched the movement in the Greek camp with a mixture of contradictory emotions. Part of her longed for an end to the conflict that her beauty had sparked, while the other part feared the consequences of any change in the current stalemate. Paris, always by her side, tried to comfort her, although his own doubts consumed him. Odysseus' plan included an additional element of persuasion. Sinon, a Greek warrior known for his ability to manipulate, would be left behind. His task was to convince the Trojans of the authenticity of the offering and the departure of the Greeks. For days, Sinon rehearsed his story, perfecting every detail of his fictional narrative. When night fell over the camp, the chosen warriors performed silent rituals of preparation. Some sharpened their weapons one last time, others made discreet offerings to the gods. In the remaining tents, quiet conversations mingled with the sound of the sea, carrying promises of glory or omens of destruction. Ebu made the final adjustments to the mechanism that would allow the warriors to get off the horse. Every hinge was oiled, every lock tested with extreme care to ensure that it would work silently when the crucial moment arrived. The craftsman was aware that his work could determine the success or failure of the entire operation. The crescent moon illuminated the Greek camp as the final preparations were made. Tomorrow, the horse would be presented to the Trojans, and the fate of two nations would be sealed. There was a feeling in the air that the gods were watching intently, ready to witness the outcome of a war that had already lasted a whole decade. Dawn brought with it the moment that would define the fate of Troy. The huge wooden horse, gleaming in the first rays of the sun, was carefully transported to its strategic position in front of the city gates. Sinon, the man in charge of convincing the Trojans, waited nervously, mentally rehearsing his elaborate story. Inside the horse, the chosen Greek warriors stood in absolute silence, their hearts beating hard against their armor. Odysseus, strategically positioned next to the opening mechanism, transmitted orders through previously agreed gestures. The space was cramped and the heat gradually increased with the morning sun. On the walls of Troy, the watchmen observed the movement on the beaches with growing curiosity. The Greek ships, with their unrefined sails, looked ready to set sail. The sight of the huge horse provoked different reactions among the defenders. Some saw it as a sign of the Greeks' surrender, while others remained skeptical about the enemy's true intentions. Cassandra, in her chambers, was seized by a vision so intense that she fell to her knees. "Fire," she murmured repeatedly. "I see fire consuming our city." Her servants, used to her prophecies, tried to calm her down, but this time there was something different in her voice, an urgency that could not be ignored. Watching the horse on the wall, Laocoon felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about that monumental structure was arousing his most primitive instincts of danger. Determined to confirm his suspicions, he started down the steps of the wall, determined to examine the supposed offering more closely. Inside the horse, Diomedes controlled his breathing, trying to ignore the growing claustrophobia. Next to him, Neoptolemus could barely contain his youthful anxiety, but was constantly calmed by the stern looks of the more experienced warriors. The slightest noise could jeopardize the entire operation. Sinon, carrying out his part of the plan, approached the gates of Troy with his hands raised in surrender. His story was meticulously prepared. He would talk about his quarrels with Odysseus, how he had been abandoned, and the true nature of the horse as an offering to the goddess Athena to guarantee his safe return to Greece. King Priam, informed of the situation, summoned his council to an emergency meeting. Opinions were divided. Some advocated accepting the gift as a sign of peace, others argued for caution. Helen, present at the meeting, remained strangely silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon through the palace windows. Laocoon, arriving at the place where the horse was positioned, began to examine it carefully. His fingers roamed over the carved wood, looking for some sign that would confirm his suspicions. Inside the structure, the Greek warriors held their breath, tense at the proximity of the priest. The tension reached its peak when Laocoon, convinced of the danger, picked up a spear and hurled it at the horse's flank. The sound reverberated through the structure, causing moments of controlled panic among the hidden warriors. Luckily, The spear hit a specially reinforced part, producing only a hollow sound. "It's a trap," shouted Laocoon to the crowd that was beginning to form. "The Greeks would never offer us a gift of peace. We must destroy this structure immediately." His words were beginning to gain traction among some of those present, threatening the entire Greek plan. It was at this crucial moment that an unexpected event changed the course of events. Two huge serpents emerged from the sea, advancing rapidly towards Laocoon and his two sons who were standing nearby. The scene that followed was one of horror. The serpents enveloped the priest and his sons, silencing their warnings in a deadly embrace. The Trojans interpreted this event as a divine sign, a punishment from Athena for Laocoon's desecration of her offering. The fear of the gods overcame any remaining fears, and the decision to accept the horse within the walls was practically unanimous. Meanwhile, the Greek ships moved away from the coast, apparently abandoning the siege once and for all. In reality, they were only heading to a predetermined point, out of sight of the Trojans, where they would wait for the signal to return. The sun was beginning to set when the Trojans finally decided to bring the horse inside the walls. Part of the main gate had to be knocked down to accommodate the monumental structure, a detail that did not go unnoticed by the warriors hiding inside. The city was in a celebratory mood. Years of war seemed to have come to an end, and the horse was positioned in the main square as a symbol of Trojan victory. Wine flowed freely, music echoed through the streets, and even the most cautious began to relax their suspicions. Cassandra, in a last desperate effort, ran to the main square. "It is our destruction that we celebrate," she shouted across the festive crowd. "The belly of this horse carries our death." As always, his words were ignored, lost amid the sounds of festivity. Inside the horse, the Greek warriors endured the heat and discomfort, patiently waiting for the right moment. Odysseus kept an eye on the sounds outside, calculating the best moment to act. Night had to fall completely, and the city had to be plunged into the deep sleep of celebration. Night fell over Troy while the celebrations continued in the streets. The wine flowed abundantly, and the sounds of music and laughter echoed through the corners of the city. The warriors on horseback remained motionless, their muscles sore from the uncomfortable position, but their minds alert and focused on the mission. Odysseus watched the movement of the torches outside through a small window, calculating the perfect moment to act. Gradually, the voices began to diminish and the footsteps became slower, clear signs that exhaustion and drink were finally overcoming the partygoers. In the palace, Priam retired to his chambers, satisfied with the apparent end of the conflict. Helen, however, couldn't sleep. Something in the atmosphere that night deeply disturbed her. From the window of her chambers, she watched the silhouette of the horse against the starry sky, an unsettling presence in the familiar landscape of the city. Cassandra wandered the halls of the palace like a tormented spirit. Her visions were now so vivid that she could barely distinguish between reality and premonition. In every shadow, she saw Greek soldiers emerging. In every nocturnal noise, she heard the harbinger of imminent destruction. Inside his horse, Neoptolemus felt a drop of sweat trickle down his forehead. The young warrior fought the urge to move, remembering Odysseus' words about the importance of absolute silence. Next to him, Diomedes stood like a statue, his experience in battle translated into an enviable calm. The hours dragged by like an eternity for the hidden warriors. The air inside the horse became heavier and heavier, and the space seemed to shrink with each passing moment. Some men prayed silently to the gods, others concentrated on their breathing, controlling their growing anxiety. Outside, the last of the partygoers finally succumbed to exhaustion. Sleepy guards made their rounds less rigorously than usual, confident that the war was over. The city gradually sank into a deep silence, interrupted only by the occasional bark of a dog or hoot of an owl. Odysseus waited until the moon reached its highest point in the sky. It was the moment they had agreed to start the operation. With precise, silent gestures, he began to transmit orders to his men. The opening mechanism was activated with extreme care. producing only a slight creak that was lost in the night. One by one, the warriors began to descend from their horses, moving like shadows in the darkness. Their armor had been carefully wrapped in cloth to minimize any metallic noise. Diomedes led a group towards the main gates, while Neoptolemus and others headed for strategic points in the city. In the palace, Cassandra woke up startled from an uneasy sleep. Her eyes widened in the dark as she heard almost imperceptible sounds coming from the main square. She ran to alert the guards, but her words, as always, were met with disdain and irritation. The Greek warriors moved with calculated precision, silently eliminating the few guards they found in their path. Years of training and planning showed in every coordinated movement, in every precise and deadly blow. Diomedes and his group reached the main gates without encountering any significant resistance. The locking mechanisms were methodically removed, paving the way for the army waiting in the shadows beyond the walls. A torch signal was discreetly sent out, visible only to eyes that knew where to look. On the distant beach, the Greek ships began their silent return, propelled by rowers who kept their oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of contact with the water. Agamemnon, on board the main ship, watched the sleeping city with a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. Inside Troy, the operation continued with lethal efficiency. Neoptolemus and his men had taken up crucial positions, eliminating guard posts and preparing for the moment when the rest of the army would enter the city. The young warrior felt the blood of his father, Achilles, boiling in his veins, eager to prove his worth in the battle to come. Helena, still awake in her quarters, was the first to notice that something was wrong. The silence of the night had become different, denser, more threatening. When she looked out of the window again, she noticed furtive movements in the shadows of the square. But before she could shout a warning, the first wave of the Greek army was already passing through the open gates. The attack began as a deadly whisper and quickly turned into a roar of war. The Trojans, drunk and unprepared, awoke to find their city already partially taken. The sound of metal against metal began to echo through the streets, mingling with cries of surprise and terror. Odysseus, watching the chaos unfold as planned, headed with a select group towards the royal palace. His aim was to capture Priam and the main Trojan leaders before they could organize any kind of effective resistance. The stratagem he had devised was finally bearing fruit, turning 10 years of stalemate into a decisive victory in a matter of hours. The night that had begun in celebration was quickly turning into a nightmare for the Trojans. The wooden horse, now empty, stood like a silent sentinel in the square, witnessing the fall of the city that had remained invincible for so long. Cunning had triumphed where brute force had failed, and the fate of Troy was sealed. The flames began to spread across Troy, illuminating the night with an eerie glow. Odysseus' plan had worked with devastating precision, and now the city that had resisted for a decade was succumbing in a matter of hours. The cries of battle mingled with the wails of the citizens, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction. Priam, awoken by the tumult, rushed to the throne room. His personal guards, still dazed, were trying to organize a belated defense of the palace. The old king watched with growing horror as his invincible city was taken from within. Through the palace windows, he could see the wooden horse, now an empty silhouette against the burning sky, a monument to his own naivety. Neoptolemus, thirsting for glory and revenge, led a group of warriors through the halls of the palace. His path was marked by ruthless violence, eliminating any resistance he encountered. The young warrior sought to prove himself worthy of the legacy of his father, Achilles, surpassing him in ferocity. Helena, trapped in her chambers, watched as Greek soldiers stormed through the palace. Her beauty, which had launched this war, now seemed insignificant in the face of the horror unfolding before her. Paris tried to protect her, but was quickly subdued by more experienced Greek warriors. The prince who had once defied the gods for love now lay wounded, unable to defend the one he had risked everything for. Cassandra, in the midst of the chaos, ran through the corridors shouting, "I told you so! I told you so!" her prophecies finally confirmed in the most terrible way possible. Her words, previously ignored, now mingled with the screams of terror and the crackling of the flames consuming the city. Ajax the Lesser, on spotting her, began a relentless pursuit through the corridors of Athena's temple. Odysseus, maintaining his characteristic strategic calm even in the midst of battle, coordinated groups of warriors to ensure that no important member of the royal family escaped. His plan was not just limited to conquering the city. It included the complete elimination of Priam's lineage to avoid future revenge. In the palace courtyard, Diomedes and his men faced the last organized resistance from the Trojan guards. The Greek warrior demonstrated why he was considered one of the most lethal in his army, his precise and deadly movements discouraging any attempt at a counterattack. Priam, seeing his city fall, took refuge at the altar of Zeus with some members of his family. The old king, who had once ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the known world, was now reduced to begging the gods for protection. Neoptolemus, finding him there, showed no mercy. The sacred altar was stained with royal blood, a sacrilege that would not go unnoticed by the gods. Andromache, Hector's widow, was desperately trying to protect her son Astyanax. She knew that the Greeks would not allow any male heir of Priam's line to survive. Her maternal love led her to try to hide the boy, but the Greek soldiers were systematic in their search. The streets of Troy became a maze of terror and destruction. Citizens ran in panic, seeking refuge in temples and sanctuaries that would soon be desecrated. The Greek warriors, drunk on victory and thirsty for revenge, made no distinction between combatants and civilians. The Greek army waiting outside the walls now flooded the city in successive waves. Agamemnon, arriving in the center of the city, gazed with wild satisfaction at the realization of his decade-long goal. The fall of Troy would be remembered for generations as a testament to both Greek ingenuity and the fragility of power. Meanwhile, in the lower streets of a city, systematic looting began. Treasures accumulated over generations were plundered, temples were stripped of their riches, and the population was subjected to all kinds of violence. The code of warrior honor that had prevailed during the 10-year siege was giving way to unbridled brutality. Odysseus, observing the destruction his plan had unleashed, felt a mixture of pride and regret. His cunning had ensured Greek victory, but the price in lives and the level of destruction exceeded even his darkest expectations. The flames that consumed Troy illuminated not only the end of a city, but also the end of an era. Dawn found Troy unrecognizable. The walls that had been her pride for so long were now stained with blood and soot. The wooden horse stood in the main square, a silent witness to the transformation of a divine gift into an instrument of destruction. The Trojan survivors, those who had not been killed or enslaved, watched helplessly as their city was systematically destroyed. The women of the royal family, including Cassandra and Andromache, were divided up as booty among the victors. Their fate as bleak as that of the city they had once called home. When the sun finally rose fully over the smoking ruins, the magnitude of the destruction became clear. Troy, the city that had held out for 10 years against the greatest army ever assembled, had fallen not by force of arms, but by the cunning of a single plan. The wooden horse would remain in the memory of future generations as an eternal symbol of how intelligence can triumph where brute force fails, and how misplaced trust can lead to total destruction. The gods, from the top of Mount Olympus, watched the outcome of their mortal interferences and disputes. The fall of Troy marked not only the end of a war, but the beginning of a new era of stories and legends that would be told and retold through the centuries, reminding everyone that even the mightiest cities can fall in the face of well-planned cunning. In a small town in the countryside, where the stories of Brazilian folklore still echoed through the corridors of the old houses and the dirt roads, lived Sophia, a 12-year-old girl known for her insatiable curiosity and her peculiar hobby of collecting lost objects. Her grandmother Dona Benedetta, a gray-haired lady with a warm smile, always told her that those objects weren't really lost. They were Seisai's pranks. Sophia lived with her grandmother in a yellow house on the side of a dirt road that meandered through the forest. The yard was a veritable paradise, full of fruit trees, cackling chickens, and an old horse called Ventania, which had belonged to her late grandfather. Every morning, the girl woke up early to brush the animal's mane, which mysteriously donned with several small, tight braids. "It's him again, Grandma," exclaimed Sophia, trying to undo the knots while Ventania neighed nervously. Saysai passed by. Donna Benedetta just smiled, shaking her head as she prepared breakfast in the tiled kitchen. "That little bugger never lets up," she replied, neither confirming nor denying the existence of the mischievous creature. At school, Sophia was considered different by her classmates. While the other children dreamed of smartphones and video games, she carried an old wooden box where she kept her lost treasures: colorful buttons, faded ribbons, small keys without locks, and even a rusty pocket watch she had found on the way to school. Miguel, his best friend and neighbor, was the only one who shared his fascination with folk tales. Together, they spent hours investigating the mysteries surrounding the region, especially after strange events began to intensify in the city. It all started when important objects began to mysteriously disappear. First, it was Professor Rita's wedding ring, then the keys to SCU Jose's grocery store, and even the church bell disappeared for a few hours, inexplicably reappearing at the top of a mango tree. The townspeople began to get restless. Some blamed the children, others suspected thieves, but Sophia and Miguel were sure it was Saysai's doing. At night, when the wind blew stronger through the trees, they could swear they heard mischievous laughter and the smell of pipe smoke hung in the air. One day, after another morning of undoing the braids in Ventania's mane, Sophia discovered something different among her treasures: a small fragment of red fabric, glowing like hot coals, which seemed to give off a heat of its own. "Grandma," she shouted, running into the house. "Look what I found!" Donna Benedetta adjusted her glasses and examined the piece of cloth with unusual interest. Her eyes sparkled in a way that Sophia had never seen before. "My granddaughter," she said in a soft voice, "this isn't just any cloth. It seems to be a piece of Saysai's cap." The revelation made Sophia's eyes widen. According to the legends her grandmother used to tell, the red cap was the source of Saysai's powers. Without it, the creature would lose most of its magic. "But how did it get here?" she asked, fascinated. "Saysai must be getting careless," replied Donna Benedetta with a mysterious smile. "Or maybe he wants to be found." That same night, while Sophia was trying to sleep, she heard a peculiar whistle coming from the backyard. It was a melody that seemed to dance with the wind, alternating between happy and melancholy notes. Through her bedroom window, she saw a figure jumping between the trees, leaving a trail of pipe smoke in the air. Sophia's heart beat faster. Years of listening to her grandmother's stories hadn't prepared her for this moment. There he was, Saysai in the flesh, hopping around on his one leg, with his pipe lit and without his full red cap. Miguel, who was sleeping next door, had also seen something. The next morning, on the way to school, he was agitated. "Sophia, you won't believe it. Last night, all the pans from the kitchen appeared on the roof of my house." Sophia showed her friend the piece of red fabric, and together they began to draw up a plan. If they could find Saysai and return the piece of the hat, perhaps they could make a deal with him. After all, in Donna Benedetta's stories, Saysai could be a great friend when treated with respect. But there was something else going on in town. The mischief was different, more frequent, and some of it even harmful. Important crops began to be destroyed. Animals ran away from the pastures without explanation, and a climate of tension hung in the air. "There's something wrong," said Sophia to Miguel, as they watched yet another mess in the central square, where all the flowers in the garden had been uprooted and replanted upside down. "The Saysai we know from the stories wouldn't harm the plants. He's mischievous, but not evil." It was then that Donna Benedetta revealed a secret she had been keeping for a long time. Sitting with Sophia and Miguel on the veranda as the sun set over the horizon, she began, "There is more than one Saysai in our forest, children, and not all of them are just playful." Sophia squeezed the fragment of the red cap in her hand, feeling its mysterious warmth. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to embark on an adventure that would forever change her outlook on the legend she loved so much, on friendship and on the true meaning of courage. Donna Benedetto's revelation about the existence of more than one Seisai left Sophia and Miguel stunned. The lady, sensing the children's curiosity, settled down in the rocking chair and continued her explanation as dusk tinted the sky orange. A long time ago, there was a balance in the forest. The Saises were guardians of nature, each responsible for a different area. Some looked after the plants, others the animals, and there were those who protected travelers, even if it was through their mischief, explained Donna Benedetta, her eyes reflecting distant memories. But what happened to this balance, Grandma? Asked Sophia, holding the piece of red cap tightly. People started destroying the forest, building more and more, and the Saises lost their space. Some became bitter, others kept their playful nature. But there is one in particular, known as Seisai Tenebroso, who has become truly evil. Miguel Swaddled. Is he the one destroying the crops? Probably, replied Donna Benedetta. And from what I can see, he must have done something to the Seisai that used to protect our region. That piece of hat you found, Sophia, belongs to our guardian Seisai. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in the children's minds. The heavier pranks, the destruction of the crops, it all made sense now. It wasn't their familiar Seisai, but this other one, the dark one, who was causing trouble. The next morning, Sophia and Miguel decided to investigate further. They started at the spot where Sophia had found the piece of the red cap, near Ventania's stable. The horse seemed more agitated than usual, neighing nervously as the children approached. "Look at that!" exclaimed Miguel, pointing to some marks on the ground. They were small, single-legged footprints, forming a path that led towards the denser forest. Sophia took out of her backpack a small compass she had found in her collections. "Let's follow these footprints," she said, determined. "But first, we need to get ready." The children returned home and filled their backpacks with items they considered essential: a flashlight, water, cookies, and a small bottle of milk, which, according to Donna Benedetta's stories, the Saises loved. Before setting off, Sophia tied the piece of the red cap around her wrist like a bracelet. She immediately felt a comforting warmth spread through her arm. Miguel watched in fascination as the bracelet seemed to glow slightly. Following the footprints, they entered the woods. The path became increasingly difficult, with low branches and vines blocking the way. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Suddenly, they heard the sound of branches breaking. Hiding behind a large tree, they saw a dark figure leaping out of the shadows. It wasn't the Seisai they knew. This one had a gloomy aura, and his cap, instead of bright red, was a dark red, almost black. "It's the Dark One," Sophia whispered, feeling the piece of hat on her wrist get even hotter. The dark sack stopped in a nearby clearing, letting out a laugh that made the hairs on the back of the children's necks stand on end. He was holding something in his hands. It looked like another red cap, but this one was torn and dirty. "I know you're there, you little busybodies." His voice was hoarse and threatening. "Have you come to look for your little friend Seisai? He's temporarily unwell." Sophia felt an inexplicable courage rise within her. The fragment of the cap on her wrist pulsed, as if it had a life of its own. She took a step forward, ignoring Miguel, who was trying to hold her back. "What do you do to him?" asked Sophia, her voice firmer than she had expected. The Dark One spun around on his one leg, staring at her with eyes that glowed like coals. Well, what have we here? A little heroin?" He took a long drag from his pipe, releasing a dark, dense smoke. "Your friend Seisai was in my way. These lands are now mine to do with as I please." Miguel joined Sophia, holding his friend's hand. "These lands are not yours. You're destroying everything." "Destroy?" The dark sack laughed again. "I'm just paying back what the humans did to us. They destroyed our forests, polluted our rivers. Why should we protect them?" Sophia noticed that the fragment of the cap on her wrist was getting hotter and hotter. On impulse, she lifted it into the air. The piece of fabric began to glow brightly, illuminating the entire clearing with a red light. The Dark One stepped back, covering his eyes. "Where did you get that?" he growled, his voice a mixture of anger and concern. Before Sophia could answer, a whirlwind of leaves began to form around her. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the familiar smell of pipe smoke, but not the dark smoke of the Dark One, but the pleasant aroma she knew so well. The children heard a cheerful, mischievous laugh echoing through the woods. It was different from the evil laughter of the Dark One. This one was full of life and fun. The fragment of the cap on his wrist glowed even brighter, as if responding to a call. "Looks like we found more than we were looking for," said Sophia to Miguel, as they both watched in amazement at the events around them. The adventure had only just begun, and they knew they would need all their courage and cunning to help their friend Seisai and restore balance to the forest. The joyful laughter materialized into a colorful whirlwind, revealing the guardian Seisai that Sophia and Miguel had been looking for. Unlike the dark Seisai, he had a warm smile and bright eyes. Although he looked weaker and more tired than usual, his cap was incomplete, perfectly matching the fragment that Sophia carried on her wrist. "I thought I'd never find this piece," exclaimed the guardian Seisai, hopping around on his one leg. "You're very brave to have come all this way, little ones." The Dark One growled, his dark smoke forming ominous shadows all around. "You shouldn't have recovered so quickly," he said, advancing menacingly. Sophia, realizing the importance of the moment, quickly untied the fragment of the cap from her wrist. "This is what you need, isn't it?" she asked the Seisai guardian, holding out the piece of red fabric. "Exactly," he replied, his eyes shining with hope. "With it, I can regain my powers completely." Miguel watched the dark Seisai attentively as he looked more and more furious. "Sophia, watch out," he shouted as the shadowy creature advanced towards his friend. But before the dark sack could reach her, Sophia threw the fragment of the hat at the guardian Seisai. The piece of fabric flew through the air as if it had a life of its own, shining brightly. When it touched the damaged cap, an intense red light enveloped the entire clearing. The Seisai guardian began to spin on its own axis, creating a small whirlpool of leaves and light. His cap, now complete again, glowed with magical energy. "Ah, how good it is to be back," he exclaimed, letting out his characteristic cheerful laugh. The Dark One took a few steps back, but maintained his threatening posture. "You may have recovered your powers, but you're not alone in this fight," he said, whistling sharply. From the shadows of the forest, other Saces began to emerge. They were different from the Guardian and the Dark One. Some looked confused, others frightened, and there were those who showed clear hostility. "Look," cried the Dark One. "These are our brothers who have also suffered from the destruction of our home. Why should we continue to protect those who despise us?" Sophia stepped forward, feeling a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Not all humans are like that," she said, her voice firm. "My grandmother always kept the stories about you alive. She taught us to respect nature and its creatures." Miguel joined his friend. "It's true, and we're not the only ones. There are many people in the city who still believe in you and try to protect the forest." The guardian Seisai smiled, leaning on his pipe. "The children are right," he said, addressing the other Saces. "Our mission has always been to maintain the balance. Yes, many humans have destroyed our forests, but others are fighting to preserve them. We must help those who still believe in us." His words seemed to touch some of the Saces, who began to approach him from the shadows. The dark Seisai realized that he was losing his allies. "Fools," he shouted, "have you forgotten how we were treated? How they turned us into mere stories to scare children?" "No," replied the guardian Seisai. "We haven't forgotten, but we haven't forgotten who we really are either. We are guardians, protectors. Our pranks have always had a higher purpose, to teach respect and humility." Sophia remembered her grandmother's stories. It's like Donna Benedetta always says, not all mischief is evil. Sometimes we need a bit of confusion to learn something important. One of the Saces who was with Tenebroso giggled. "The girl speaks like a true connoisseur of our stories," he said, jumping to the guardian's side. One by one, the other Saces began to do the same, leaving the dark sack increasingly isolated. His dark smoke began to thin, and his dark red cap seemed to lose some of its gloomy shine. "It's not over," he growled, before disappearing in a swirl of black smoke. The guardian Seisai sighed. He's right about one thing. It's not over, but now we're united again, and with the help of friends like you, we can protect what's left of our forests. Sophia and Miguel exchanged looks of satisfaction. They had not only found their friend Seisai, but it also helped to bring together the guardians of the forest. What happens now? Asked Miguel, observing the various Seises who now filled the clearing with their laughter and joyful antics. Now, replied the guardian Seisai, we need to restore the balance, and for that, we'll need the help of more people who still believe in us. Sophia immediately thought of her grandmother. Dona Benedetta will be so happy to know that she was right all along. The guardian Seisai gave her a mischievous wink. Your grandmother always knew more than she seemed to, little Sophia. In fact, she's been a great ally of ours for a long time. The children's eyes widened at the revelation. There was much more to discover about Dona Benedetta and her connection with the Seises. But one thing was certain. The adventure was far from over, and new challenges awaited them on the way home. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, as Sophia and Miguel followed the guardian Seisai back to town, accompanied by a joyful procession of bouncing Seises. The air was full of mischievous laughter and pipe smoke, but now was a pleasant smoke that carried promises of better days and many adventures ahead. On the way home, Sophia and Miguel could hardly contain their excitement at their discoveries. The guardian Seisai and his companions accompanied them, invisible to the eyes of the townspeople, but their presence was felt through the little antics they got up to along the way. Leaves dancing in the wind, distant laughter, and the familiar scent of pipe smoke. When they arrived at their grandmother's house, they found Dona Benedetta on the porch, as if she had been waiting for them. Her serene smile revealed that she knew much more than she seemed to. I see you've made new friends, she said, looking directly at the Seises that only children could see. Benedetta, exclaimed the guardian Seisai, making himself visible and bowing comically. How long, my old friend? Sophia and Miguel were stunned. Grandma, can you see them? Asked Sophia, still processing the situation. Of course, my dear, replied Dona Benedetta, getting up from her rocking chair. In fact, it's high time I told you the whole truth. She led everyone into the house, including the Seises, who floated happily around the room. Dona Benedetta went to an old chest that had always remained locked, the same one that Sophia had tried to open several times when she was a child, driven by her natural curiosity. This chest, she explained, reaching for a key hanging around her neck, holds memories of a time when humans and magical beings lived in greater harmony. As she opened the chest, a golden glow emanated from within. Inside were several fascinating objects: an old leather-bound diary, yellowed photographs, small vials of colored substances, and, to everyone's surprise, a red cap very similar to that of the Seises. Grandma, did you? Sophia started to ask, but found herself at a loss for words. Yes, my dear. For many years, I was a human guardian, a bridge between our world and the magical world, Dona Benedetta revealed, stroking the red cap affectionately. Your grandfather was also a guardian. Together, we protected the forest and kept the traditions alive. The guardian Seisai added, Benedetta and Joao were fundamental in keeping our existence a secret during the most difficult times, when modernization threatened to completely erase our presence. Miguel, who was watching everything with fascination, picked up one of the old photographs. It showed a group of people around a campfire, and if you looked closely, you could make out some shadowy shapes that looked like Seises. Were there more human guardians? He asked. Many, replied Dona Benedetta. We formed a protection network. Each region had its own guardians, who worked together with the local magical beings. But over time, people lost their connection with the magical world, and our numbers dwindled. Sophia leafed through the diary found in the trunk, discovering detailed records about the Seises, their characteristics, their powers, and, most importantly, the ancient alliances between humans and magical beings. Is that why the dark sack became so bitter? She asked. Because humans have forgotten those alliances? Partly, replied the guardian Seisai. taking a thoughtful puff from his pipe. But the truth is more complex. The Dark One was one of the most powerful among us, and also one of the most attached to humans. When they started destroying the forests and denying our existence, he suffered the most. Donna Benedetta agreed with a sad nod. The pain turned him into something he wasn't. But there is still hope. If we can gather new human guardians and re-establish the old alliances, perhaps we can bring him back to the right path. "We want to be guardians," exclaimed Sophia and Miguel in unison. The guardian Seisai laughed, his laughter echoing through the room like joyful bells. "You already are children. Today you proved it by helping us in the forest. But being a guardian takes more than courage. It takes commitment, wisdom, and, above all, a heart open to the magic of the world." Donna Benedetta opened a small wooden box at the bottom of her truck. Inside were 2 small pendants in the shape of a red cap. These amulets belonged to other young guardians in the past. Now it's time to pass them on. As he placed the pendants around the children's necks, a sensation of warmth and energy ran through their bodies. It was as if a new awareness was awakening within them. They could feel the presence of magic around them more intensely. "What do we do now?" asked Miguel, still admiring his pendant. "Now," said Donna Benedetta, "we begin the real work. We need to find others who still believe, rekindle the flame of magic in people's hearts, and above all, protect what's left of our forests." The guardian Seisai agreed, his expression more serious than usual. "And we need to prepare ourselves. The Dark One hasn't given up, and I'm sure he's planning something big." As if to confirm his words, a cold, unnatural wind blew through the house, rattling the windows. In the distance, thunder reverberated, even though the sky was still clear. "He's gathering his strength," murmured Donna Benedetta, her worried gaze turned towards the forest. "And he's not alone. There are other creatures of darkness who would like to see the magical world remain in the shadows." Sophia clutched her pendant with determination. "Then we also need to gather our strength. There must be more people in the city who still believe, even if they don't know it." Later that night, Sophia, Miguel, and Donna Benedetta began to draw up their plans. The Saces spread out around the town, observing discreetly and identifying possible allies. The guardian Seisai remained nearby, guiding the children through their first steps as guardians. "Everyone has a spark of magic inside them," explained Donna Benedetta as she taught the children how to use their new amulets. "Our job is to help them rediscover that connection." The next morning, on their way to school, Sophia and Miguel began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. Through their amulets, they could see little signs of magic everywhere. Flowers that glowed softly at dawn, birds that seemed to carry messages in their songs, and mysterious footprints that appeared and disappeared. At school, Rita, who had lost her wedding ring the day before, was especially receptive to the magic, even without realizing it. When a hummingbird flew in through the classroom window and hovered in front of her for a few moments, her eyes lit up in a special way. "She has potential," whispered the guardian Seisai, invisible to everyone except Sophia and Miguel. "Look at how the plants in her classroom are more lush than the others." During the break, the children began to tell their classmates stories about Brazilian folklore. To their surprise, many were interested, sharing their own experiences of unexplained events. "My grandmother always says there's a curupira protecting the forest near her house," commented Julia, a classmate. "And my uncle swears he saw a boitada once," added Pedro, another student. Sophia and Miguel exchanged meaningful glances. The seed of belief was still alive. It just needed to be nurtured. However, their mission was interrupted by a disturbing event. The previously clear sky suddenly darkened. A dense, dark cloud, charged with supernatural energy, began to form over the city. The Dark One was putting his plan into action. "He's summoning creatures from the shadows," explained Donna Benedetta as the children ran into her house after school. "Beings who, like him, have been corrupted by bitterness and forgetfulness." From the center of the dark cloud, sinister shapes began to emerge. Corrupted batatas, their fiery bodies now black as coal. Shadowy curupiras with glowing red eyes, and other beings from Brazilian legends. all transformed by the evil influence of the dark Seisai Tenebroso. "The time has come," said Sophia, her amulet glowing brightly. "We need to gather everyone who still believes." Miguel agreed, his own amulet pulsing in tune. "But how are we going to do that?" Just then Ventania, Sophia's old horse, neighed loudly in the yard. The animal had always had a special connection with the magical world, as evidenced by the braids in its mane. Now this connection could be its greatest advantage. "The animals," exclaimed Dona Benedetta. "They have always maintained their connection with magic. They can help us awaken people's belief." The guardian Seisai smiled, his mischievous expression returning. "And don't forget, we have our own mischief to use against the forces of darkness." Quickly a plan was hatched. While the dark Seisai tried to frighten people with dark manifestations, they would respond with demonstrations of joyful, beneficial magic. The allied Seises spread throughout the city, making flowers sprout instantly, creating rainbows in the middle of a storm, and filling the air with magical music. Sophia and Miguel, riding Ventania, galloped through the streets, their amulets shining like beacons of hope. People began to come out of their homes, amazed by the spectacle. Teacher Rita was one of the first to really see the magic, her eyes opening to a world that had always existed around her. Soon others followed. SCU Jose from the grocery store, the priest from the church, and more locals. The dark sacred one, realizing that he was losing strength, decided to make his final move. He descended from the heavens in a whirlwind of darkness, directly confronting Sophia, Miguel, and the guardian Seisai. "You don't understand," he shouted. "The humans are going to betray you again. They're going to destroy everything once again." "You're wrong," replied Sophia, her amulet glowing brighter than ever. "People can change, they can learn, and we guardians are here to help them remember the importance of magic and nature." The final showdown was less a battle and more a demonstration of the power of love and belief. Each person who regained their faith in magic was like a blow to the power of darkness. The corrupted beings, one by one, began to return to their original form. Finally, the dark Zack himself felt the transformation. His dark red cap began to lighten, and the bitterness in his eyes was replaced by tears of understanding. "Forgive me," he whispered, as the darkness dissipated from his being. "I have forgotten the true meaning of being a guardian." With the victory of light over darkness, a new era began for the small town. People not only believed in the legends again, but became active protectors of nature and magical traditions. Dona Benedetta, proudly watching her young apprentices, knew that the future of magic was in good hands. Sophia and Miguel had proved themselves worthy successors to the ancient line of guardians, and more importantly, they had shown that the power of belief and friendship can overcome any darkness. And so, as the sun set on that memorable day, the sound of mischievous laughter echoed through the town, reminding everyone that magic, after all, had never really left. It was just waiting to be rediscovered by pure hearts and brave souls. The guardian Seisai, reunited with his now restored brothers, including the repentant former Dark One, continued his antics, but now with an even more noble purpose: to keep the flame of magic alive in the hearts of every person willing to believe. And what about Sophia and Miguel? Well, their adventures as guardians had only just begun, but that's a story for another day. In a small hut on the edge of a dense forest lived John, a humble woodcutter, with his wife Maria. Life had never been easy for the couple, who faced days of hard work just to make ends meet. The hut, built by Joao himself years ago, was constantly in need of repair, with its wooden walls creaking in the wind and the roof threatening to cave in during the strongest storms. Joao woke up every day before sunrise, carrying his worn-out axe on his back and following the winding path that led into the heart of the forest. His steps were heavy, marked by years of walking the same route, while Maria stayed at home, tending the small vegetable garden they kept at the back of the hut and doing sewing work for the wealthier families in the nearby village. On that particular morning, the sky had a different hue, a deeper blue than usual, and the air carried a peculiar scent, a mixture of wild flowers and morning dew. John noticed that something was different as soon as he entered the forest. The birds were singing a more harmonious melody, and the leaves of the trees were dancing almost hypnotically in the gentle breeze. As he walked among the centuries-old trees, his thoughts wandered to the situation in which they lived. Winter was approaching and food reserves were scarcer than usual. Maria had commented the night before about how nice it would be to have a little more comfort, perhaps some chickens in the yard or an extra loaf of bread on the table. John felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, wishing he could provide a better life for his beloved wife. Then something extraordinary happened. As he approached an ancient oak tree that he was planning to cut down, John heard a soft, melodious voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "John, the kind-hearted woodcutter," said the voice, causing him to stop immediately, his axe hanging in the air. From behind the tree emerged an ethereal figure, bright as moonlight and translucent as the morning mist. It was a forest fairy, with wings that looked like they were made of dewdrops and a dress woven from threads of sunlight. Her eyes shone with the wisdom of thousands of years, and her smile carried the kindness of the universe. "I've been watching you, John," continued the fairy, floating gracefully until she was face to face with the astonished woodcutter. "Day after day, you enter this forest, not out of greed or destruction, but out of necessity. You cut down only the oldest trees, those that have already lived their full lives, and always plant new saplings in their place. Your kindness and respect for nature have not gone unnoticed." John, still dumbfounded, could hardly find the words to reply. His calloused fingers gripped the axe handle tighter, not out of fear, but out of the emotion that was taking over his being. The fairy continued, her voice softer than the rustling of the leaves. "For your kindness and consideration, I would like to offer you a special gift. I grant you 3 wishes, 3 opportunities to change your destiny." The woodcutter finally found his voice, although it came out shaky and hesitant. 3 wishes? But how can I deserve such a gift? I'm just a simple woodcutter." The fairy smiled even more tenderly. "It's precisely your humility that makes you worthy. Remember, though, wishes are powerful, but they must be used wisely. Once uttered, they cannot be undone, except by another wish. Choose carefully, because sometimes what we think we want is not what we really need." With these words, the fairy handed John a small crystalline stone, which glowed with a light of its own. "When you're ready to make a wish, hold this stone close to your heart and speak your words clearly. But remember, 3 wishes, no more, no less." John tucked the stone into the pocket of his patched shirt, feeling its comforting warmth against his chest. His mind was already beginning to buzz with possibilities. Wealth, eternal health, a palace? The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. That evening, as John returned home earlier than usual, he could hardly contain his excitement to tell Mary about his extraordinary encounter. The sun was already setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as he hurried along the familiar path. His wife would certainly know how to help him choose the wisest desires. After all, she had always been the wiser of the two, with her prudent advice and thoughtful nature. However, as he approached their humble abode, John could not have imagined that this extraordinary gift was about to put his life and their relationship to the test in ways he had never imagined. The stone in his pocket pulsed gently, as if reminding him of the power and responsibility he now carried with him. Maria was at the door of the hut when she spotted John returning earlier than usual. Her brown eyes immediately detected something different about her husband. There was a liveliness in his step that she hadn't seen for years. As he approached, John gestured energetically, his face lit up with a smile that seemed not to fit. "Maria, my dear," he exclaimed, hurrying across the small yard. "You won't believe what happened today." Without waiting for an answer, John began to recount his encounter with the forest fairy, describing every detail with the enthusiasm of a child. Maria listened intently, her eyes growing wider as the story unfolded. "3 wishes?" she finally asked when John had finished his account. "Anything we want, Her hands, calloused from years of housework, trembled slightly as John showed her the crystalline stone that still pulsed gently in his pocket. The couple entered the small hut, where the aroma of a thin vegetable broth filled the room. They sat down at the simple wooden table, the magic stone placed carefully between them, its soft glow illuminating their faces in the twilight gloom. "We need to think very carefully," said Maria, always practical. "We could ask for a bigger house, or perhaps a flock of sheep." Her voice was interrupted by a loud growl from her stomach, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the small fire in the wood-burning stove. John watched his wife, noticing how she looked longingly at the almost empty pot on the fire. Winter was approaching, and their provisions were scarcer than ever. "Oh, how I wish I had a big, juicy sausage right now," sighed Maria, almost without realizing she had spoken aloud. At the same moment, the crystalline stone began to glow brightly, and before either of them could react, a huge sausage appeared on the table, its delicious aroma instantly filling the entire hut. John suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair. "Maria, how could you be so impulsive? It was one of our 3 precious wishes." His voice shook with frustration and disappointment. All the careful planning she had imagined during her walk home seemed to have been wasted in a moment of weakness. Maria, realizing the extent of her mistake, began to weep silently. "I am sorry, Zon. I was so hungry. I didn't think." Her tears fell onto the worn wooden table, while the sausage, the object of all the confusion, remained there, provocatively perfuming the room. John's anger grew as he saw the situation. Years of deprivation and hard work, and now one of his precious desires had been wasted on a simple sausage. Without thinking about the consequences, overwhelmed by the frustration of the moment, he grabbed the crystalline stone and exclaimed, "I wish this sausage would stick to your nose." The horror of the situation only became apparent when the stone glowed again, and in the blink of an eye, the sausage flew off the table and stuck firmly to Maria's nose. She let out a scream of surprise and despair, her hands trying futilely to tear away the food now firmly stuck to her face. "John, what have you done?" Maria screamed in panic, running around the small hut. "Get away from me. Get off me now." Her attempts to remove the sausage were futile. It was magically stuck, as if it had become part of her face. Regret overtook John instantly. All his anger dissipated at seeing his beloved wife in such a state of distress. "Maria, forgive me. I didn't mean to. I was angry. I didn't think straight." He tried to approach her, but Maria pulled away, still crying and desperately trying to get rid of the sausage. Night fell completely over the small hut, finding the couple in an absurd and desperate situation. 2 of the 3 wishes had already been used, and all they had to show for it was a sausage stuck to Maria's nose. The heavy silence was broken only by Maria's occasional sobs and the crackling of the wood in the stove. John sat heavily in his chair, the crystalline stone still in his hands, now with only a faint glow, as if he were mocking his foolishness. There was only one wish left, and the situation had become infinitely worse than it had been before his encounter with the fairy. Her words echoed in his mind. Wishes must be used wisely. Maria slowly approached the table, her eyes red from crying, the sausage still firmly stuck in her nose as a constant reminder of her impulsiveness and John's thoughtless anger. The couple looked at each other, the realization of their folly weighing on them like a heavy blanket of regret. The silence in the hut was almost palpable, broken only by Maria's occasional sobs and the crackling of the wood in the stove. John stared at the crystalline stone in his hands, its faint glow reminding him that only one wish remained. The situation had turned into a nightmare, and the simplicity of their previous lives now seemed like a distant dream. "We need to think calmly," John finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We can't waste the last wish like we did with the other 2. Maria nodded silently, her hands unconsciously touching the sausage that still remained firmly stuck to her nose. The couple spent the next few hours discussing their options. They could use the last wish to ask for immense riches, John argued, and then they would have enough money to consult the best doctors and wizards in the kingdom to solve Maria's nose problem. Or they could ask for infinite wisdom, Mary suggested, and then they would find a solution on their own. But as the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that none of these options were really viable. Maria could barely eat or drink with the sausage on the way, and the discomfort was becoming unbearable. Besides, the people in the village would surely notice her peculiar condition, and the shame would be unbearable. "John," Maria said softly, after yet another failed attempt to take a sip of water, "you know what we need to do." Her words carried a weight of resignation that made John's heart squeeze. He knew she was right. There was no real choice to be made. With a deep sigh, John held the crystalline stone close to his chest, as the fairy had instructed. "I wish for the sausage to disappear from Mary's nose," he pronounced clearly, his voice trembling slightly. The stone glowed one last time with an intensity that lit up the whole hut, and in the blink of an eye, the sausage was gone. Maria touched her nose, now free, with a mixture of relief and sadness. They were back where they started, as poor as before, but with a valuable lesson learned the hard way. The couple embraced in silence, their tears mingling as they reflected on the extraordinary events of that day. The next morning, as the rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, John and Mary sat at their simple table, sharing the same thin vegetable broth they had eaten the night before. The crystalline stone, now dull, rested on the table as a silent reminder of their adventure. "You know, John," said Maria, breaking the thoughtful silence, "maybe we've received something more valuable than 3 wishes." John looked at her, curious. "We've learned that we already have what really matters. We have each other, our home, and although it's simple, it's more than enough." John reached across the table and took his wife's hand. "You're right, my love. The fairy said that wishes should be used wisely, but the real wisdom was in realizing that we didn't need them in the first place." As they talked, they began to notice small changes around them. The sun seemed to shine more brightly through the gaps in the walls, illuminating their humble abode in a way they had never noticed before. The scent of the wild flowers that Maria used to pick to decorate the table seemed sweeter, and the birdsong outside sounded more melodious. "Perhaps," said John, getting up to start his day's work, "the real magic lies not in wishes granted by fairies, but in learning to value what we already have." Maria smiled, silently agreeing as she began to tidy up the kitchen. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes for the couple. Joao began to notice more the small joys in his daily work. The way the sunlight filtered through the treetops, the satisfaction of planting a new sapling after felling an old tree, the comforting sound of his axe rhythmically tapping against the wood. Maria, for her part, found new joy in her domestic chores. Her sewing for the families in the village became even more exquisite as she came to see each stitch as a little work of art. The vegetable garden at the back of the house seemed to thrive under her renewed care, as if responding to her newfound contentment. The townspeople began to notice the change in the couple. There was a serenity in their faces that hadn't been there before, a quiet joy that seemed to emanate from within them. Some said it was as if they had been touched by some kind of magic, although no one could explain exactly what had changed. And so, life continued its course in the small hut at the edge of the forest. The crystalline stone found its place on a shelf above the fireplace, serving as a constant reminder not of the wishes they had lost, but of the valuable lesson they had gained. John and Mary discovered that the real magic was not in transforming their lives through magical wishes, but in learning to see the magic that already existed in their simple, love-filled lives. As the seasons passed, the story of the 3 wishes of the woodcutter and his wife began to spread through the village. First as whispers between neighbors, then as a local legend that the elders told the youngsters on winter evenings around the fireplace. Some doubted, others fervently believed, but all agreed that there had been something different about John and Mary since that memorable day. The most notable change was not in their material possessions, which remained as modest as before, but in the way they faced life's adversities. One particularly difficult afternoon, when a storm damaged part of the hut's roof, The couple faced the setback with a serenity that surprised their neighbors. "Remember, John," said Maria as she helped her husband pick up the pieces of wood scattered around the yard, "how we would have reacted to this before the 3 wishes?" John smiled, remembering how they used to despair at every little misfortune life presented them with. The news of the couple who had wasted 3 magical wishes eventually reached the ears of a wealthy merchant passing through the village. Intrigued by the story, he decided to pay a visit to the woodcutter's humble hut. He arrived on an autumn morning, his well-fed horse contrasting with the simplicity of the place. "I heard that you had the chance to have everything you wanted," commented the merchant, sitting down at the simple table where Maria had served herbal tea. "How can you seem so happy after missing out on such an opportunity?" John and Mary exchanged a complicit glance before answering. "Sir," John began, "we've learned that sometimes what we think we want isn't what we really need. The fairy gave us 3 wishes, but she gave us something much more valuable, the ability to see the wealth we already possess." The merchant watched the couple curiously. Despite their worn clothes and the simplicity of their home, there was a dignity in their posture and a light in their eyes that he rarely saw even among the wealthiest people he knew. Before leaving, he offered Joao a job on his property, with a generous salary and a bigger house to live in. To his surprise, the couple politely declined the offer. "Our lives may seem poor in the eyes of others," Maria explained, "but we have discovered that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we are able to appreciate." The news of the couple's refusal only increased their reputation in the village. People began to seek them out not only to buy firewood or order sewing, but also in search of advice and wisdom. Maria, with her natural kindness, began to teach other women in the village how to find beauty in the simplest of everyday tasks. John, for his part, began to take young apprentices with him into the forest, teaching them not only the art of cutting down trees, but also the importance of respecting and preserving nature. He shared with them the knowledge he had accumulated over the years about which trees to choose, how to plant new saplings, and how to maintain the forest balance. On one such occasion, while they were walking along the familiar trail, one of his apprentices asked him if he had ever seen the forest fairy again. John stopped for a moment, looking thoughtfully at the surrounding trees. "Not with my eyes," he replied, "but I feel her presence in every breeze that moves the leaves, in every ray of sunlight that passes through the branches, in every new seedling we plant." The crystalline stone, now dull, remained in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, but it had become more than just a reminder of their adventure. It was a symbol of transformation, not because of the magic it had once contained, but because of the change it had brought about in their lives. One night, as the couple were getting ready for bed, Maria noticed something different about the stone. "John, come and see this," she called, pointing to a soft glow that seemed to emanate from the crystal. It was a different light from before, softer and more constant, like the glow of moonlight on a clear night. "Perhaps," suggested Joao, hugging his wife as they watched the phenomenon, "it's a reminder that true magic has never left us. It just changed into something deeper and more lasting." The small hut, which had once seemed so inadequate and precarious, had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the secret of true happiness. The wooden walls, although they still creaked in the wind, now seemed to contain an ancient wisdom, as if they had absorbed the lessons learned by their inhabitants. Maria's garden flourished in an extraordinary way, its flowers and herbs growing with a vigor that seemed almost supernatural. People said that her medicinal plants had special properties, capable not only of curing physical ailments, but also of bringing peace to the spirit. And so, without realizing it, John and Mary had become guardians of a different kind of magic than the one they had initially been offered, a magic that didn't depend on wishes or enchantments, but sprang naturally from the hearts of those who had learned to see beauty in simplicity and richness in what they already possessed. The years passed gently over the little hut at the edge of the forest, and with them, John and Mary's story continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The wisdom they had acquired through their experience with the 3 wishes became something greater than themselves, touching the lives of everyone around them in subtle but profound ways. One particularly special morning, while the dew was still covering the grass in the yard, a young mother from the village arrived at their door, carrying her sick son. The boy was pale and feverish, and the local doctors had already given up on finding a cure. Maria, who over the years had perfected her knowledge of medicinal herbs, welcomed them with the same kindness that had become her trademark. While preparing tea with herbs from her enchanted garden, Maria shared the story of the 3 wishes with the young mother. "See that stone over the fireplace?" she asked, pointing to the crystal that still occasionally emitted its soft glow. It taught us that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments. The little patient, who could barely keep his eyes open, seemed to wake up a little when he heard the story. Maria continued her narrative while administering the tea, and little by little, a healthy color began to return to the child's cheeks. The mother, amazed, swore she had seen a special glow emanating from the herbs when Mary picked them from the garden. John, who watched the scene from the door of the hut, smiled as he realized how his wife had changed over the years. She wasn't just a healer with her medicinal herbs. She had become a keeper of stories and wisdom, using her experiences to help others find their own way. News of the boy's miraculous recovery spread quickly, attracting even more people to the small hut. But what really impressed visitors was not the supposed healing powers of Mary's herbs, but the atmosphere of peace and contentment that permeated the place. One day, while John was working in the forest with his apprentices, he felt a familiar presence. The air became lighter, and the leaves on the trees danced in a way he hadn't seen since that fateful day years ago. For a moment, he thought he caught a glimpse of the fairy's ethereal silhouette among the trees, her smile as gentle as he remembered. "Master John," called one of his young apprentices, interrupting his thoughts, "why didn't you ever want to build a bigger house, even after your medicinal herbs started bringing in some money?" John leaned his axe against a tree and sat down on a fallen log, inviting the young man to join him. "Let me tell you a story about desires, satisfaction, and the true nature of wealth," he began, his eyes shining with the wisdom of years. Meanwhile, in the hut, Maria was visited by a young bride from the village who had come to ask for advice on how to build a happy marriage. The crystalline stone over the fireplace glowed softly as Maria began to share her story, as if she approved of passing on that hard-won wisdom. "The secret," Maria explained, "is not in having everything you want, but in learning to want what you already have." His words carried the weight of lived experience, and the young bride felt she was receiving something much more valuable than simple marriage advice. As the sun began to set, John returned home to find his wife preparing dinner. The scent of fresh herbs mingled with the soup on the stove, creating a welcoming atmosphere that seemed to embrace everyone who entered the small hut. "You know, Maria," said John as he sat down at the family table, "today in the forest, I had the impression that our magical friend was watching us again." Maria smiled, understanding perfectly what he meant. The magic they had experienced on that distant day had never really left them. It had just transformed into something more subtle and permanent. That night, as the couple prepared for bed, the crystalline stone began to glow with an intensity it hadn't shown for years. A gentle breeze blew in through the window, bringing with it the scent of wild flowers and a whisper that seemed to say, "You've learned your lesson well." John and Mary fell asleep holding hands, their hearts filled with gratitude, not for the desires they had lost, but for the wisdom they had gained. The little hut, which might have seemed inadequate to some, was for them a palace of contentment and peace. The story of the 3 wishes continued to be told in the village for generations, becoming a legend that carried a universal truth. The real magic is not in getting everything we want, but in learning to find joy and contentment in what we already have. And so the little hut at the edge of the forest remained a beacon of hope and wisdom, reminding all who visited that sometimes the greatest treasures in life are not those we can wish for, but those we discover along the way, in the lessons learned and the love shared. The crystalline stone, a silent witness to her journey, continued to glow softly over the fireplace, no longer as a symbol of unfulfilled desires, but as a constant reminder that true magic resides in the hearts of those who have learned to see beauty in simplicity and richness in contentment. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the skies of ancient China with shades of red and gold reminiscent of the flames that almost consumed the world. Hui, the most skilled archer in the celestial realm, watched the only remaining sun complete its daily journey, remembering the events that changed the fate of humanity forever. His fingers instinctively caressed the familiar texture of his bow, while his thoughts wandered to the days when 10 blazing suns threatened to turn the earth into a lifeless desert. In their modest mountain home, his wife Chang'e was preparing afternoon tea, her movements as graceful as the dance of cherry blossoms in the wind. The soft scent of jasmine filled the room, mingling with the breeze coming through the rice paper windows. It was hard to believe that, just a few months earlier, that same air was so hot that it burned the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe it. Still thinking about that day, Chang'e asked softly, approaching with 2 cups of tea in her hands. Her dark eyes reflected the concern she felt for her husband, who carried the weight of his actions like an invisible cloak over his shoulders. Hui nodded, accepting the cup she offered him. How could I not think? 9 heavenly brothers, 9 divine lives that I had to extinguish to save countless others. Her voice trembled slightly, revealing the depth of her anguish. The couple remained in contemplative silence, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky. In a small carved wooden chest, carefully stored in their bedroom, lay the reward Hui had received from the Celestial Empress, the elixir of immortality, a gift that, although valuable, weighed on their consciences like a cursed precious stone. In the days following the great hunt of the suns, rumors began to spread about the existence of the elixir. Whispers in the village streets, covetous glances from strangers who passed their house, shadows that seemed to follow them when they went to the market. The threat was silent, but it grew like weeds after the rain. Chang'e watched her husband with growing concern. Every day, new stories reached her ears about bandits and warlords planning to steal the elixir. Some said that entire armies were mobilizing, waiting for the right moment to strike. The peace they had longed for after saving the world seemed more and more distant. One night, while Hui slept, Chang'e was startled awake by a noise coming from the garden. Through the silver moonlight, she saw shadows sneaking between the trees. Her heart raced as she realized that her fears were coming true. Quietly, she got up and went to the chest where the elixir was kept. Her hands trembled as she held the delicate bottle containing the golden liquid. Years of love and dedication to her husband weighed heavily on her heart against the responsibility she felt to protect something so powerful. The voices of the invaders approaching the house echoed in her ears like a dark omen. In a moment of crystal clarity, Chang'e understood what she needed to do. With silent tears streaming down her face, she woke Hui with a gentle touch. "My love," she whispered, "forgive me for what I'm about to do. It's the only way to keep the elixir out of the wrong hands." Before Hui could react, Chang'e brought the bottle to her lips and drank its contents in a single gulp. Immediately, an ethereal light began to emanate from her body, and she felt lighter than air. Hui, now fully awake, stretched out his arms to reach her, but his fingers only passed through the luminous form of his beloved. "Chang'e," he shouted, his voice filled with despair and disbelief. The invaders, alerted by the shout, burst through the door, only to witness the moment when Chang'e began to float towards the night sky. As she ascended, Chang'e kept her eyes fixed on her husband's, trying to memorize every detail of his beloved face. The wind whispered old songs of love and loss in her ears as the distance between them grew inexorably. The moon, big and bright in the sky, seemed to be calling her, offering a refuge for her lonely eternity. The bandits, realizing they had arrived too late, fled into the night, leaving Hui alone with his pain. He remained in the garden until dawn, his bow forgotten at his side, watching the moon where his beloved would now dwell forever. On the horizon, the single sun he had spared began its daily journey, a constant reminder of the price they had both paid for the good of humanity. On the moon, Chang'e found an unexpected companion, a jade rabbit, eternally busy preparing the elixir of immortality in its celestial pestle. The rhythmic sound of his work became the music that filled his lonely nights, as he watched the earth spinning below, so close and yet eternally out of reach. Thus began the legend of Chang'e, the Lady of the Moon, whose sacrifice for the greater good eternally separated her from her beloved Hoey. Her story would become an eternal reminder that sometimes the truest love manifests itself not in unity, but in the sacrifice necessary to protect those we love and the world we share. The weeks after Chang'e's ascent to the moon were a blur of pain and regret for Hoey. The silence in her home was deafening, every corner still echoing with memories of her beloved. The teacups she used to prepare remained untouched, covered in a fine layer of dust, as he didn't have the heart to move them from where she had last left them. During the day, Hoey wandered through the fields and mountains he had once traversed with his bow, hunting and protecting the nearby villages. Now, the instrument that had made him famous rarely left its corner on the wall. His hands, once firm and precise, trembled slightly when he touched the bowstring, as if the object itself shared his sadness. The villagers, who had once revered him as a hero, now watched him with a mixture of pity and silent respect. Some of the elders left offerings on his doorstep, bowls of rice, fresh fruit, jasmine tea, but Hoey barely touched the food. His appetite, like his will to live, seemed to have risen to the moon along with Chang'e. One night, while gazing at the full moon from his garden, Hoey noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was the old sage of the mountain, an old man who had long served as a counselor and healer for the inhabitants of the region. His eyes, although clouded by age, still shone with an ancient wisdom. "Grief can be a treacherous companion, young archer," said the old man, taking a seat next to Hoey. "It promises comfort in the familiar presence of pain, but ends up imprisoning us in a cage of our own construction." Hoey turned his gaze to the old man, his words touching something deep in his broken heart. "How can I move on when every breath reminds me of her? When every glance of the night sky shows me what I've lost?" The wise old man smiled gently, his wrinkled fingers tracing patterns in the damp earth. "Your wife didn't choose her fate out of whim or cowardice. She made a sacrifice not only for the greater good, but also for you. Honoring her memory means living the life she protected with such love." The elder's words pierced the fog of sadness that enveloped Hoey. For the first time since Chang'e's departure, he began to consider his own role in the story that was still being written. His beloved had become an eternal guardian, protecting the elixir of immortality from the wrong hands. Shouldn't he also find a purpose that honored his sacrifice? In the days that followed, Hoey slowly began to emerge from his cocoon of sadness. He returned to practicing with his bow, although each arrow he shot still carried the weight of his memories. He began teaching young archers in the village, sharing not only his skills with the bow, but also the lessons of honor, sacrifice, and love that his story with Chang'e had taught him. In the evenings, when the moon shone brightest, Hoey would sit in his garden and talk to Chang'e, telling him about his day, about his students' progress, about the small changes in the village. Sometimes, when the night breeze blew gently, he could swear he heard her laughter on the wind, or felt the soft touch of her hand on his face. The jade rabbit, Chang'e's faithful companion on the moon, watched these nocturnal conversations as he continued his eternal work of preparing the elixir. The rhythmic sound of his celestial pestle became a kind of background music for the words of love and longing that Hoey sent to the heavens. One day, while training a particularly promising group of young archers, Hoey noticed something different in the air. A heavenly messenger, shining with a light of its own, descended from the heavens, bringing news of the heavenly empress. Silence fell over the training ground as everyone watched the ethereal figure approach. "Hoey, the great archer," announced the messenger, his voice resounding like crystal bells. "The heavenly empress has observed your pain and your strength. She has seen how you have honored your beloved sacrifice and how you continue to serve humanity despite your loss." Hoey's heart raced, a mixture of hope and apprehension growing in his chest. The messenger continued, "In recognition of your nobility and Chang'e's sacrifice, the Empress has decreed that once a year, during the Mid-Autumn Festival, you may visit your beloved on the moon." The news spread quickly through the village and beyond. people began to prepare for what would become one of the most beautiful celebrations in Chinese culture. Lanterns were hung, mooncakes were prepared, and stories about the eternal love between Hui and Chana began to be told in every home. As the date of the festival drew closer, Hui felt his heart lighter than it had been in months. The prospect of seeing Chana again, even for a brief moment, gave new meaning to each day. He began to look at the moon with new eyes, no longer just as a symbol of his loss, but as a reminder of the strength of true love and the power of sacrifice for the greater good. The arrival of the Mid-Autumn Festival transformed the landscape of ancient China. Everywhere, red lanterns decorated the streets and houses, their lights dancing like little earthly stars. The air carried the sweet scent of mooncakes, prepared with dedication by families celebrating the promise of reunion between lovers separated by fate. Hui watched the preparations with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. His students, realizing the importance of the moment, had offered to help with the rituals necessary for his temporary ascension. The old sage of the mountain supervised everything, ensuring that every detail was in accordance with the heavenly messenger's instructions. "Remember," said the old man, as he lit incense on a makeshift altar, "time on the moon flows differently. What will seem like a night to us here on Earth will be like a precious moment suspended in eternity for you too." As the full moon began its ascent over the horizon, bigger and brighter than anyone had ever seen, Hui felt an ancient and powerful energy envelop him. His body began to feel lighter, and a golden light similar to the one that had enveloped Chang'e on his departure now surrounded him. The ascent was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was like floating on a river of silver light, while the stars danced around him. The air became thinner, but Hui felt no lack of oxygen. A deep peace enveloped him, as if every moment of pain and loneliness from the last few months was being washed away by the moonlight. When his feet touched the lunar surface, Hui was momentarily dazzled by the ethereal beauty of the place. The ground glowed with a soft jade hue, and on the horizon, crystal palaces reflected the light of the stars in thousands of different colors. The silence was absolute, but somehow comforting. It was then that he saw her. Chana was more beautiful than in his memories, her figure emanating a soft light and her black hair dancing in a non-existent breeze. Beside her, the jade rabbit momentarily interrupted his eternal work, his glowing eyes watching the lovers reunite. "My love," whispered Chana, his voice carrying the echo of eternity. "You've come." Hui ran towards her, his arms closing around her in an embrace that tried to make up for all the months of separation. Silent tears streamed down both their faces, but they were tears of joy, no longer of sadness. "I've missed you so much," said Hui, her voice choked with emotion. "Every day without you was like an endless winter." Chana smiled, gently touching her husband's face. "I watched you every day, my dear. I saw your pain, your growth, and how you honored our love by teaching others the value of sacrifice and courage." The jade rabbit approached silently, offering them a small table with tea and heavenly mooncakes. The aroma was both familiar and unlike anything Hui had ever experienced, as if the stars themselves had been distilled into a drink. As they shared this heavenly meal, Chana told Hui about his life on the moon. She talked about the peace she found in her role as guardian, about the silent conversations with the jade rabbit, and about how every night she sent her blessings to Earth through the moonlight. "It's not as lonely an existence as you might think," she explained, her fingers intertwined with his. "Every ray of moonlight that touches the Earth carries a bit of my love for you and for the humanity we are sworn to protect." Hui talked about her students, about how their story had spread and inspired others to make sacrifices for the common good. He talked about the changes in the village, about how people now celebrated their love as a symbol of hope and devotion. Time seemed to flow differently on the moon, as the wise old man had warned. Moments stretched out like eternities, and hours passed like seconds. Starlight danced around them, creating patterns that told ancient stories of love and sacrifice. "Even separated by distance," said Chana, our love continues to grow and inspire others. Perhaps this is the true purpose of our destiny, to show that true love transcends even the barriers between heaven and earth. The jade rabbit, who had returned to his eternal work, was making soft music with his pestle, a melody that seemed to lull the universe into a cosmic dance. Hoey and Chana danced under the stars, their movements in perfect harmony with the celestial rhythm. As their time together came to an end, there was no sadness in their hearts, only a deeper understanding of the meaning of their love and sacrifice. Chana gently kissed Hoey's lips, a kiss that carried the promise of future meetings and eternal love. "Take the moonlight with you," she whispered, "and know that on every clear night, when I look up at the sky, I'll be looking back at you, my beloved archer." Hoey felt the same golden energy begin to envelop him again, signaling that it was time to return to Earth. His last glimpse was of Chang'e, radiant in her immortal beauty, alongside the faithful jade rabbit, both waving goodbye as he gently descended back into the mortal world. By the time Hoey returned to Earth, the Mid-Autumn Festival had turned into an even more meaningful celebration. The people of the village, who had witnessed his ascent to the moon, eagerly awaited his return, still lit lanterns illuminating the night with a welcoming glow. The old sage of the mountain was the first to welcome him, his wise eyes shining with curiosity and understanding. In the days that followed, Hoey noticed a profound change in himself. The pain of separation, although still present, had transformed into something softer, more meaningful. Every time he looked at the moon, he saw not just the place where his beloved lived, but a reminder of the transformative power of true love. The archer began to devote more time to teaching, sharing not only archery techniques, but also the lessons he had learned on his journey. His students, now more numerous than ever, came from far and wide, attracted not only by his legendary skill with the bow, but also by the wisdom that emanated from his words. "True power lies not in the strength of the arm that draws the bow," he would tell his young apprentices, "but in the strength of the heart that guides the arrow." His words carried the weight of experience, tempered by the love and sacrifice that had shaped his life. One particularly meaningful afternoon, while supervising the training, Hoey noticed a young woman among his students who reminded him of Chang'e. She had the same determination in her eyes, the same gentle but resolute spirit. Her name was Mei Ling, and she had traveled from far away after hearing the story of the archer and his beloved on the moon. "Master Hoey," said Mei Ling after a training session, "the people in my village tell different versions of your story. Some speak only of the sadness of separation, others of the heroism of defeating the 9 suns. But what is the real lesson we must learn?" Hoey reflected for a moment, watching the sun set over the horizon. "The real lesson, Mei Ling, is that love is not measured by physical proximity, but by the depth of the sacrifice we are willing to make for the sake of those we love and for the greater good." Her words touched something deep in the hearts of everyone present. Over the next few days, more stories began to emerge about how Chang'e's sacrifice and Hoey's devotion had inspired acts of courage and selflessness across China. One particularly touching story came from a distant village, where a young girl had risked her life to save children from a fire, citing Chang'e's courage as her inspiration. Elsewhere, a feudal lord, moved by the archer's story, had abandoned his war plans and dedicated his resources to helping those in need. The jade rabbit, watching all this from the moon, shared these stories with Chang'e as she continued her eternal work. She smiled as she saw how her sacrifice had become a source of inspiration and hope for so many. One evening, as Hoey watched his students practicing by the light of the lanterns, the wise old man approached again. "Do you realize," he said, "that your story with Chang'e has become more than a tale of love? It has become a beacon of light for those who seek to find strength in difficult times." Hoey nodded, deeply understanding the truth in the elder's words. "Every time I teach someone to shoot a bow," he replied, "I'm not just teaching them a skill. I'm sharing a part of our history, a part of the love that Chang'e and I share." The next festival brought a new tradition to the village. In addition to mooncakes and lanterns, people began to write letters. Letters of love, hope, forgiveness. and burned them in small bonfires under the full moon, believing that their words would reach Chang'e, who would bless them with his heavenly grace. Mei Ling, who had become one of Houyi's most dedicated students, organized a special performance during the festival. Together with other archers, she coordinated a demonstration where arrows with miniature lanterns were shot into the night sky, creating a light show that seemed to dance with the stars. Houyi himself, watching the demonstration, felt his heart fill with pride and gratitude. Each little light that rose into the sky was like a messenger of hope, a reminder that even on the darkest nights, love finds ways to light the way. And so the story of Houyi and Chang'e continued to grow and transform, no longer just as a tale of separation and sacrifice, but as a testament to the enduring power of true love and its ability to inspire generations. Each new student who learned the art of the bow, each story shared around the festival bonfires, each gaze directed at the full moon, carried with it a piece of that eternal love that had transcended the barriers between heaven and earth. The years passed like leaves carried by the autumn wind, and Houyi's wisdom grew along with her legend. His hair, once as black as the moonless night, now displayed silver strands that shone like the stars he watched so much. His eyes, although more wrinkled, retained the same intense glow that had captured Chang'e's heart so many years ago. The archery school he had established had become a center of learning not only for martial arts, but also for the deeper lessons of love, sacrifice, and devotion. Mei Ling, now a master archer in her own right, assisted Houyi in training the next generation, perpetuating not only the techniques, but also the values that had become the heart of his teachings. One particularly meaningful afternoon, while watching her students practice, Houyi noticed something different in the air. A gentle breeze carried cherry blossom petals, out of season, dancing in patterns that resembled celestial calligraphy. The old sage of the mountain, now even older but just as perceptive, appeared silently beside him. "The signs are present, my friend," said the old man, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. "The celestial empress has been watching your journey with great interest." That night, as the moon rose over the horizon, a new heavenly messenger descended from the heavens, his light softer than the first who had brought the news of the annual festival. His eyes shone with the compassion of ancient stars, and his voice echoed like distant music. "Houyi, guardian of the One Sun," announced the messenger, "your dedication to sharing the lessons of love and sacrifice has touched heavenly hearts. The Empress offers you a choice. You can ascend to the moon permanently, joining Chang'e in immortality, or remain on Earth as guardian of the stories and traditions you have inspired." The silence that followed was as heavy as the morning dew. Everyone present, students, villagers, and even the forest animals, seemed to be holding their breath, awaiting the great archer's decision. Houyi closed his eyes, his heart torn between his desire to be reunited with his beloved and his responsibility to those who had trusted in his teachings. It was Mei Ling who spoke first, her voice soft but firm like the string of a well-tensioned bow. "Master, your story with Chang'e has taught us that true love transcends physical distance. Perhaps your true mission is to continue to be the bridge between heaven and earth, just as the moon is the bridge between Chang'e and us." Her words echoed deeply in Houyi's soul. He remembered all the lives that had been touched by his story, all the hearts that had found courage in the example of his love for Chang'e. The heavenly messenger waited patiently, his light pulsing softly like a distant star. "My decision," Houyi began, his voice carrying the certainty of one who has found his true purpose, "is to remain here, continuing to share the lessons Chang'e and I have learned on our journey. Our love doesn't need physical proximity to continue inspiring others." The messenger smiled, as if he had expected this answer. "The Celestial Empress foresaw your choice, noble archer. In recognition of your wisdom, she grants you a new gift. From now on, during each Mid-Autumn Festival, not only will you be able to visit Chang'e, but all those whose hearts are truly open to love will be able to glimpse, through the moonlight, the eternal dance of lovers separated by fate." Word spread quickly, and the Mid-Autumn Festival took on a new meaning. People began to look more closely at the moonlight during the celebration, and many swore they saw, On the clearest nights, the silhouettes of Hoey and Chama dancing among the clouds, with a jade rabbit beating his pestle to a heavenly rhythm. The years went by, and Hoey grew old with the grace of someone who accepts the natural cycle of life. His teachings were recorded in manuscripts that would be passed down from generation to generation. Mei Ling and other master archers established new schools in different parts of China, each carrying a part of the original story. On his last night on Earth, during a particularly bright mid-autumn festival, Hoey gathered his closest students. With a serene smile, he shared one last lesson. True love is not about possessing or always being together. It is the ability to sacrifice oneself for the greater good, to inspire others to be better, and to find beauty even in separation. That night, legends say, the moon's glow was more intense than ever. When Hoey closed his eyes for the last time, his spirit did not ascend directly to the moon as many had expected. Instead, he transformed into thousands of tiny lights, like golden fireflies, which spread throughout the world. These lights, the elders say, can still be seen today during the Mid-Autumn Festival, when the love between Hoey and Chana is celebrated. They appear as reflections in the lanterns, sparkles in the tears of separated lovers, and sparks of hope in the eyes of those who believe in the transformative power of true love. And so the story of Hoey and Chana lives on, not just as an ancient legend, but as a constant reminder that love, in its purest and highest form, has the power to transcend even the barriers between heaven and earth, inspiring generations to find the courage to make their own sacrifices for the greater good. The icy October wind blew through the faded tarps of the Shooting Star Circus, making them snap like the sails of a ghost ship. It was 1931, and the Great Depression had turned America into a graveyard of dreams. Between the shadows of the empty stands, Thomas laughed. Murphy was adjusting his makeup in front of a cracked mirror, his trembling fingers sliding red lipstick over lips that no longer knew how to smile naturally. The makeshift dressing room was a small wagon decorated with yellowed photographs of better times. In each one, Thomas smiled genuinely, surrounded by crowds who still had reason to laugh. Now, at 45, his wrinkles were deepening under the white paint, like furrows dug by time and sadness. "Are you still performing tonight, Tom?" asked Sarah, the young trapeze artist, leaning against the carriage door. Her green eyes carried the same concern that everyone in the circus shared. Thomas was more than a clown. He was the beating heart of the Shooting Star. Even if that heart was getting weaker and weaker. "The show can't stop, darling," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "People need a few laughs more than ever." His gaze met hers through the mirror, and for a moment, Sarah saw beyond the mask. She saw the man who carried the weight of making others smile while his own soul shattered. The Shooting Star Circus had once been one of the biggest in the American Midwest. Now, it was just another traveling attraction struggling to survive. The grandstands, once packed, could barely hold a few dozen spectators. People had bigger problems than spending their last dime on entertainment. Frank Miller, the circus owner, a burly man with a poorly trimmed mustache, entered the wagon without knocking. "Murphy, we need to talk about the numbers," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of financial worries. "We can't go on like this." Thomas continued applying his makeup as if he hadn't heard. He knew that conversation well. It was the same one that had destroyed so many other circuses in recent years. "Frank, do you remember what you told me when you hired me? A clown isn't just a performer, he's a doctor of the soul." Frank sighed, running his hand over his tired face. "That was 20 years ago, Tom. The world was different. People were different. This sadness is the same," replied Thomas, standing up. His colorful suit contrasted with the gloomy atmosphere of the wagon. "Perhaps even greater now. That's why we need to keep going." Sarah watched the scene in silence, her hands clenching nervously at the hem of her tracksuit bottoms. She had grown up in the circus, and Thomas was like a father to her. Watching him struggle to keep alive not only the spectacle, but the very essence of what it meant to bring joy, broke her heart. Outside, the small town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, stretched out like a mosaic of hopelessness. Rows of unemployed people snaked through the streets, and for sale signs decorated the facades of once thriving stores. It was against this backdrop that Thomas Laugh Murphy had made a silent promise to keep making people laugh, no matter what the cost. "I have an idea," said Thomas, his eyes shining with an intensity Sarah hadn't seen for months. "What if we gave free performances to the children at the orphanage? Think about it, Frank. We might not make any money, but we'll make something more valuable. Hearts." Frank shook his head, but there was a trace of a smile on his lips. "You've always been an idealist, Murphy. That's why I haven't sent you away yet." Night was beginning to fall, and the first stars were appearing in the Iowa sky. Thomas approached the mirror one last time, adjusting his red nose. In the reflection, for a brief moment, he swore he saw something different, a younger version of himself, smiling with a joy he had long since lost. "You know," he said, turned to Sarah and Frank, "they say a clown never really dies. We keep making people laugh, even after we're gone." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "Don't talk like that, Tom. You still have a lot of shows ahead of you." Thomas smiled, but there was something different in his gaze, a mixture of determination and melancholy that seemed to transcend the present moment. "Of course, darling. And I promise that as long as there's a single mirror in this world, I'll keep bringing smiles." The circus canvas snapped again in the wind, and the lights began to come on one by one. In a few minutes, albeit to a small audience, Thomas Laugh Murphy would be on stage once again. Little did he know that this promise, made in a moment of emotion, would echo through the decades in a way that no one could have predicted. The distant sound of children laughing reached the wagon, and Thomas felt his heart warm. Maybe Frank was right. The world had changed, but as long as there were people who needed a smile, there would be room for a clown who took his mission as seriously as his own life. "It's time," he announced, adjusting his colorful hat. "Let's make these people forget their troubles, if only for a few minutes." As Thomas walked towards the arena, Sarah couldn't help but notice how his shadow seemed to dance on the walls of the wagon, as if it had a life of its own. It was only the beginning of a story that would mix laughter and mystery, joy and melancholy, in a dance that would continue far beyond that night in October 1931. The night wore on as Thomas made his way to the arena, his footsteps echoing through the dimly lit passageway. The familiar smell of sawdust and candies mingled with the cold October air. His thoughts wandered between memories of the golden days of the circus and the harsh reality they now faced. As Thomas approached the curtain that separated the backstage area from the arena, he heard the few voices that made up the audience that night. Among them, he distinguished the crystal-clear sound of children's laughter, the children from the local orphanage who had received free tickets. Their little faces lit up with anticipation were all the fuel he needed. Sarah watched from afar, her heart squeezing as she saw Thomas adjust his posture, like a soldier preparing for battle. This was how he viewed each performance, a sacred mission to bring light to the darkness that had settled in people's hearts during the Great Depression. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice sounded tired, but still trying to maintain the grandeur of yesteryear. "With you, the legend of the Shooting Star Circus, the man who brings smiles to even the darkest nights, Thomas Laugh Murphy." The clown walked through the curtain with his characteristic comic stagger, but something was different that night. His movements, although as precise as ever, seemed to carry an extra weight, a shadow that only the most attentive could notice. The performance began like so many others. The usual antics, the jokes he had told hundreds of times, the tricks that made the children squeal with delight. But there was a different intensity to his performance, as if every gesture, every expression, was a declaration of love for his art. Between acts, Thomas noticed a little girl in the front row. Her large, attentive eyes followed him with a mixture of fascination and sadness that he recognized immediately. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. During a pause, he approached her, pulling a colorful scarf seemingly out of nowhere. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice gentle behind the painted smile. "Lucy," she answered shyly, "from St. Vincent's Orphanage." Thomas turned the handkerchief into a paper flower, his nimble fingers dancing in the air. "You know Lucy, "Sometimes life can seem a bit sad," he said, handing her the flower, "but there's always magic hidden in the most unlikely places." The girl held the flower as if it were a precious treasure, and her smile lit up the whole arena. At that moment, Thomas felt a pang in his chest, a painful reminder of his own mortality that had become more frequent in recent months. Frank watched from the backstage entrance, his financial worries momentarily forgotten in the face of the magic he was witnessing. He knew Thomas wasn't well. The doctors had been clear about his heart condition, but seeing him there, turning sadness into joy, was a reminder of why the Shooting Star Circus was still going. The show went on, and Thomas seemed to get better by the minute. His jokes were sharper, his movements more graceful, as if he were channeling a lifetime of experience into a single evening. The audience's laughter echoed through the tent, louder and more genuine than it had been in months. Sarah noticed that the shadows cast by Thomas on the tent walls seemed to have a life of their own, dancing in an almost supernatural way. It was as if multiple versions of him were performing simultaneously, each carrying a different facet of his personality. Towards the end of the show, Thomas prepared for his favorite act, the mirror trick. With a theatrical gesture, he revealed a full-length mirror in the center of the arena. The object, an old circus relic, looked mysterious under the colored lights. "You see," he announced to the audience, "sometimes it's not what's in front of the mirror that matters, but what it reflects in our hearts." As he stood in front of the mirror, something strange happened. For a brief moment, his reflection seemed to move independently, as if it were a separate entity. Some children gasped, but most interpreted it as part of the show. Lucy, still holding her paper flower, leaned forward in her seat, her eyes wide with fascination. She was the only one who noticed when Thomas gently touched the mirror and whispered something that sounded like a promise. The end of the performance was met with enthusiastic applause. Not many people, but their affection was genuine. Thomas took his final bow, his smile brighter than ever, even if his legs trembled slightly under the weight of the effort. Backstage, Sarah rushed over to help him. "Tom, you looked amazing today," she said, noticing how he leaned heavily on her shoulder. "Just doing my job, darling," he replied, his breathing a little wheezy. "Just reminding people that there's still magic in the world." Frank approached, carrying an envelope. "Murphy, about that idea of free performances. Maybe we could try it. You tried something today?" Thomas smiled, but his eyes were fixed on the mirror that was still in the arena, reflecting the lights that were beginning to fade. For a moment, everyone present swore they saw something strange in the reflection, as if multiple smiles were hovering on the silver surface. "You know," said Thomas, his voice carrying a different tone, "they say that every great artist leaves a bit of their soul in every performance. Maybe that's true in more ways than we realize." The night was beginning to say goodbye, and with it, something in the air seemed to change. The shadows on the circus walls danced with a life of their own, and the mirrors in the dressing room caught reflections that shouldn't have been there. It was as if Thomas's promise to keep bringing smiles was already beginning to take shape in ways that no one could have predicted. That same evening, after the show, Thomas remained at the circus long after everyone had left. Sitting in his dressing room, he gazed at his reflection in the cracked mirror, slowly removing the makeup that had become his second skin over the years. "It's funny," he muttered to himself, "how a painted face can hide so many truths." His fingers trembled more than usual as he wiped away the last trace of white paint. The mirror now revealed not only his tired face, but also shadows that seemed to move on their own in the corners of the reflection. Sarah had insisted on staying with him, worried about his condition after the extraordinary performance, but Thomas had kindly refused her company. "Some conversations," he said with an enigmatic smile, "we need to have only with our own reflection." The autumn wind continued its melancholy dance around the circus, making the tarpaulins moan like ancient beached whales. Thomas picked up a worn photo album that he kept in a drawer, his private collection of memories of the shooting star. Each page told a different story. Each image captured a moment of joy that now seemed to belong to another life. As he leafed through the album, one photograph in particular caught his eye. It was from his first circus performance 20 years ago. Young Thomas was smiling genuinely at the camera, his eyes shining with hope and determination. But there was something strange about the image. In the shadows behind him, there seemed to be another smile, one that he was sure hadn't been there when the picture was taken. "Curious," he whispered, bringing the photograph closer to his face. The smile in the shadows seemed to wink at him, like a distant star in the night sky. A sudden noise made him look up. In the dressing room mirror, his reflection didn't follow the movement. For a moment that seemed to span eternity, Thomas observed his own image smiling back at him, regardless of his expressions. "So that's how it's going to be?" he asked his reflection, his voice calm despite the extraordinary nature of the situation. The Thomas in the mirror only widened his smile, his eyes carrying all the joy that the real Thomas had lost over the years. Outside the carriage, little Lucy, who had hidden after the show, watched in fascination through a crack in the window. She watched as Thomas stood up and touched the mirror with his fingertips, and as his reflection made the same gesture, but with an almost imperceptible delay. "I always knew there was something magical about you, Mr. Murphy," she whispered to herself, clutching the paper flower he had given her against her chest. Thomas felt her presence and turned to the window, but Lucy had already disappeared into the darkness. What remained was a strange feeling that something fundamental had changed that night, as if the real world and the world of reflections had begun to mix in unpredictable ways. Picking up his old makeup case, Thomas began to organize his belongings with special care. Each item had its own story. The red nose his mentor had given him, the broken comb he'd been using for decades, the magic handkerchief that always kept tricks up its sleeve. "You know," he said to his reflection in the mirror, who was now watching him with an expression of understanding, "I always wondered if it was me who made people laugh, or if it was something bigger through me." The reflection tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. The shadows in the carriage seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, dancing on the walls like silent spectators of a singular conversation. Thomas felt that twinge in his chest again, stronger this time. His heart, that old companion of so many performances, seemed to want to tell him something. He sat down heavily in his chair, taking a deep breath as drops of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Not yet," he muttered, as much to himself as to his reflection. "I still have promises to keep." In the photo album open on the table, the pictures seemed to take on a new dimension. In each of them, in the shadows and in the less noticeable corners, mysterious smiles began to appear, as if the past was being rewritten before his eyes. The wind outside increased in intensity, and with it came the distant sound of laughter. Not the laughter of the present, but echoes of all the joys Thomas had provided throughout his career. It was as if the circus itself was alive, breathing memories and exuding magic. Sarah, who had decided to go back to check on her friend one last time, stopped at the wagon door when she heard Thomas talking. But when she looked out of the window, she saw only him sitting alone, smiling at his own reflection, as if sharing an intimate secret with a younger, happier version of himself. "Tom," she called softly, knocking on the door. "Is everything all right?" "Never better, darling," he replied, without looking away from the mirror. "Just finding out that some shows never really end." Thomas's words carried a weight that Sarah couldn't fully comprehend, but which made her heart clench with a mixture of love and concern. She knew, somehow instinctively, that she was witnessing the beginning of something both wonderful and melancholy. Dawn crept in as Sarah stood at the entrance to the carriage, watching Thomas through the crack in the door. Something in the atmosphere had changed. The air seemed denser, charged with an invisible electricity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Sarah, darling," Thomas's voice sounded different, as if it had come from a long way away. "Do you remember the first time you saw me perform?" She entered the carriage, taking a seat next to him. "Of course I do. I was only 6 years old. You made a balloon elephant that looked real. I swore I was going to start walking any minute." Thomas smiled, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the mirror. "The magic isn't in the tricks, you know. It's in the eyes of the beholder, in the will to believe that there is something extraordinary in the world." The wind outside had turned into a peculiar symphony, mixing the creaks of the canvas with whispers that seemed to carry distant laughter. The photographs scattered on the table seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, each image telling its own silent story. Lucy, who had sneaked back into the circus, watched everything from the wagon window. Her childlike eyes, not yet limited by the bonds of adult disbelief, caught details that others couldn't see, like the shadows that danced independently of the light, or the smiles that appeared and disappeared in the reflections. Tom, Sarah held her old friend's hand, noticing how cold it was. Maybe we should call a doctor. There's no need, he replied, his voice surprisingly firm. Tonight is not about endings, but about new beginnings. Frank appeared at the wagon door, his normally stern face marked by genuine concern. Murphy, we found this in the old circus archives, he said, handing Thomas a yellowed envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph even older than the others. It showed the Shooting Star Circus in its early days, decades before Thomas joined the troupe. But there, in the shadows of the tent, was a familiar smile, a face that looked impossibly similar to his own. Extraordinary, isn't it? Thomas laughed softly. It feels like I've always been here, in one form or another. Sarah and Frank exchanged worried glances, but before they could say anything, a sound of childish laughter filled the air. Lucy had finally plucked up the courage to enter the carriage, still clutching her paper flower. Mr. Murphy, she said, her voice small but determined, are you really going to keep making people smile forever? Thomas knelt in front of her, his movements slow but graceful. You know, Lucy, there are different ways of being present. Sometimes we're in the smiles we leave behind, in the memories we plant in people's hearts. The wagon lights flickered on, and for a moment everyone swore they saw multiple reflections of Thomas in the mirrors, each from a different era, each carrying a unique smile. It was as if time had folded in on itself, allowing different versions of him to coexist in the same space. Frank, Thomas turned to the circus owner. Promise you'll keep the Shooting Star alive, not for the profits, but for what it represents, a place where magic is still possible. Frank, normally so pragmatic, felt tears forming in his eyes. You have my word, Murphy. This place will always be a sanctuary for dreamers. Sarah realized that something fundamental was changing. The shadows in the carriage had begun to move more pronouncedly, as if responding to a song that only they could hear. Thomas's reflection in the main mirror was smiling with a vivacity that contrasted with his increasingly serene expression. Lucy, Thomas called out to the girl again. You can see it, can't you? The smiles in the shadows, the stories in the photographs. The girl nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. They've always been there, haven't they? Waiting to continue the show. Thomas smiled, a smile as genuine as those in his older photographs. Exactly. And now, my dear, I must prepare for my next performance. He stood up, walking over to the main mirror. His reflection awaited him, no longer as a simple image, but as a doorway to something beyond ordinary comprehension. The photographs scattered around the wagon seemed to vibrate with an energy of their own, each smile captured on paper beginning to come to life. Sarah wanted to stop him, to grab his arm and keep him there, but something in her heart knew that this moment was inevitable and perhaps necessary. Frank remained silent, witness to a transformation that defied all logic. A clown never really dies, said Thomas, his voice mixing with the wind that blew through the circus. He just finds new stages, new ways to bring joy. When he touched the surface of the mirror, it wasn't his reflection he found, but a portal to all the laughter that was yet to come, all the joy that still needed to be shared. Lucy smiled, being the only one who truly understood what was happening. The magic wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new phase. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the echo of all the past and future performances of the Shooting Star Circus. And on that extraordinary night, while the world outside continued its struggle against the Great Depression, something wonderful and inexplicable happened in a small circus wagon in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A clown was fulfilling his last and most important promise. The next morning, the news spread quickly through the small town of Cedar Rapids. Thomas' laugh, Murphy had left during the night, but the circumstances of his departure generated more whispers and speculation than sadness. The wagon where he had spent his last hours was exactly as it had been left. Old photographs scattered on the table, his clown costume carefully folded on the chair, and the main mirror reflecting the dawn light in a peculiarly vivid way. Sarah was the first to enter the carriage that morning, her eyes still red from a bad night's sleep. The air inside the small space felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The photographs on the table had changed subtly. In each one, Thomas's smile seemed more alive, more present. "He's really done it, hasn't he?" Lucy appeared in the doorway, still holding her paper flower, now a little crumpled but still magical. "He's found a way to keep making people smile." Frick arrived soon after, carrying the morning papers. The headlines talked about the economic crisis, about banks closing and families losing everything, but on the inside pages, a small note caught the eye. Circo Estrella announces free performances for underprivileged children. "That's what he wanted," said Frank, his voice hoarse with emotion. "To keep the magic alive, especially for those who need it most." The days that followed brought subtle changes to the Shooting Star Circus. People began to notice strange things, reflections that seemed to move on their own, laughter that echoed when no one was around, and above all, the mysterious smiles that appeared in old and new photographs. Sarah took on the responsibility of organizing Thomas's belongings, but every time she tried to put his things away, something inexplicable happened. The photographs returned to the table, as if they wanted to continue telling their stories. The main mirror refused to be covered. Any cloth placed over it would mysteriously fall off during the night. Lucy began to spend more time at the circus, especially in the old wagon. She talked to the reflections as if they were old friends, and sometimes the other performers swore you could hear answers in the laughter the wind brought. "Look," she exclaimed one afternoon, pointing to a new photograph of the circus. In the image, taken during a recent performance, Thomas's characteristic smile could be clearly seen in the shadows of the stairs. News of this extraordinary occurrence spread, first as a whisper among the performers, then as an urban legend throughout the city. People started coming to the circus, not just for the shows, but in the hope of capturing in their own photographs a glimpse of the legendary clown who had promised never to stop making people smile. The most remarkable thing was how Thomas's presence seemed strongest during the moments of greatest joy. When the children laughed, the mirrors in the circus reflected multiple smiles. When someone took a photograph of a particularly happy moment, it was almost certain that a familiar smile would appear in the shadows of the image. Frank, initially skeptical, began to notice changes in himself. The financial worries, although still present, seemed less burdensome. He found himself smiling more often, especially when he passed Thomas's carriage, where the main mirror continued to reflect much more than just images. "It's as if he's found a way to turn all the sadness into something beautiful," Sarah commented one evening, observing how the circus lights danced differently, creating patterns that resembled smiles on the tent walls. The Great Depression continued outside, but inside the Shooting Star Circus, something magical was happening. Free performances for underprivileged children had become a tradition, and with them, stories about a clown who appeared in reflections, bringing smiles at the most unlikely moments. Lucy, who had become a sort of unofficial guardian of Thomas's legacy, began collecting stories from people who swore they had seen him. Each account was different, but they all shared a common element, the feeling that, even in the darkest moments, there was room for a smile. "He taught us that the real magic is in how we choose to see the world," she said one day, organizing her growing collection of mysterious photographs. "Sometimes you have to look through the reflections to find the truth." The Shooting Star Circus didn't just survive the Great Depression. It flourished, becoming a beacon of hope in difficult times. People came not just for the entertainment, but for the chance to experience something truly magical. And so the story of Thomas Laugh Murphy continued, not as a sad legend, but as a constant reminder that joy can find its way through the most unlikely of circumstances. His smile, multiplied infinitely through reflections and photographs, became a symbol of resistance against the darkness of the times. On the quietest nights, when the wind blew through the circus tarpaulins, you could still hear the echo of his laughter, mixed with the thousands of others he had inspired over the years. His last act had not been an end, but a beginning, the start of a new form of magic that would continue to touch hearts and inspire smiles for generations. And in every mirror, in every photograph old or new, in every moment of genuine joy, Thomas laughed. Murphy continued to fulfill his promise, proving that some stories never really end. They just find new ways to be told, new hearts to touch, and new smiles to inspire.